괜찮아. 해치지 않아.
Are you here to help me? Here to help me?
Her tiny, frostbitten hand didn't reach for food. It reached for a stranger's coat, the same coat that belonged to the most feared man in New York's underworld. 15 years later, that same hand would hold the gavel-splitting evidence that saved his empire from ashes. New York City doesn't do gentle. It does cold, indifferent, and occasionally cruel. A city that will step over you in Louboutins without spilling its coffee. On the night of December 3rd, 2011, the temperature had dropped to 14 degrees, and on a stretch of Flatbush Avenue that smelled like exhaust fumes and old regret, a refrigerator box was doing its best impression of a home. Inside it, 12-year-old Amara Johnson had stopped shivering 10 minutes earlier. She didn't know that was the bad sign. She just knew the cold finally felt like a blanket instead of a blade, which, if you know anything about hypothermia, is usually the moment right before it kills you. 3 blocks away, in the back of a black Mercedes gliding down the avenue like a shark in still water, Kang Tae-sung was reviewing a shipment manifest and considering, with the mild irritation of a man doing accounting, that one of his warehouse managers in Red Hook had been skimming product for the last 6 months. In about 4 minutes, that manager would be having a much worse night than anyone currently freezing on a public sidewalk. Tae-sung didn't do sentiment. Sentiment was expensive, and in his line of work, imports, logistics, and the occasional persuasive conversation involving a baseball bat, expensive things got you killed. He ran the Beck Host Syndicate the way other men ran hedge funds, coldly, precisely, and with an aversion to unnecessary risk. So when his driver, a broad-shouldered man named Yoon, slowed the car and said, "Sir, there's a kid back there, not moving," Tae-sung's first instinct was to say keep driving. New York produced tragedies the way vending machines produced snacks, constantly, and usually nobody's business but the machines. But he looked. And here is where irony, that great cosmic comedian, decided to have some fun. The coldest man in Brooklyn's underworld had a memory he kept locked in a mental vault more secure than any of his actual vaults. His daughter, Soo Jean, dead of pneumonia at age 7 in an apartment he'd been too broke, too proud, and too busy building his empire to properly heat. Grief, it turns out, doesn't respect a decade of silence. It just waits by the door for the right cardboard box to knock. "Stop the car," Tae-sung said. "You nearly swerved into a fire hydrant." In 11 years of driving this man, he had never once heard him say those 3 words for a reason that wasn't business. Tae-sung stepped out into the cold in a coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, knelt down beside the box, and found a girl who looked like she'd already made peace with not waking up. He didn't check her pulse like a doctor. He checked it like a father, frantic, furious at the universe, and refusing to accept the answer his fingers were giving him. "She's alive," he said, which was less a statement of fact and more a threat directed at fate itself. He took off his coat, the same coat, ironically, that his tailor had once joked was worth more than a small war, and wrapped it around her like he was defusing something explosive, which, in a sense, he was. Because nothing detonates a criminal empire quite like compassion in the wrong hands. By the time they reached the hospital, Amara's fever had broken, her fingers had color again, and Kang Tae-sung had made a decision that would send shockwaves through his own organization for the next 15 years. He was keeping her. His lieutenants would call it madness. His enemies would call it weakness. History, as it turned out, would call it the smartest business decision he ever made, though not for reasons anyone in that Mercedes could have possibly predicted on a frozen December night in Brooklyn. Because somewhere in a courtroom 15 years in the future, that same girl would stand up, briefcase in hand, and prove that the coldest man in New York had once made the warmest decision of his life, and that sometimes the empire you save isn't the one built on blood. It's the one built on the moment you chose not to keep driving. The Kong residence sat on a bluff in Riverdale, all glass and steel and quiet menace, like a museum that also happened to launder money. Amara woke up there 3 days after the hospital, in a bed so soft it felt like a trick, in a room so clean it felt like an interrogation. The first face she saw wasn't Tae-sung's. It was a woman named Grace Okafor, the household's longtime housekeeper and, unofficially, its only functioning conscience, who took one look at Amara's wide, wary eyes and said, Relax, baby. Nobody in this house is going to hurt you. Well, she paused, considering the men downstairs cleaning firearms like other people clean golf clubs. Nobody's going to hurt you. It was, Amara would later reflect, the single most honest sentence spoken in that house for the next 15 years. Taesung didn't visit her room that first week. He sent Grace with food, sent a doctor with vitamins, and sent, bizarrely, for a man who ran an empire of fear, a stack of library books, because apparently even Mafia bosses believed idle hands were the devil's workshop and idle minds were worse. When he finally did appear, he didn't crouch down to her level or offer some warm speech about family. He stood in the doorway like a man inspecting a business acquisition. You will go to school, he said. You will learn Korean. You will learn mathematics. And you will learn to read people before they read you. This is not kindness. This is preparation. Preparation for what? Amara asked, because even starving, freezing, and 12, she had never been a girl who let a threat go unquestioned. For a world, Taesung said, that already decided what you'd become the day it left you in a box on Flatbush Avenue. You will prove it wrong. It should have sounded cruel. Instead, it landed like the first real promise anyone had ever made her. The years that followed were not, by any stretch, normal. Amara grew up doing homework at a dining table, sometimes flanked by men discussing shipping routes in low, clipped Korean, learning to tell, purely by the temperature of the room, whether a business meeting downstairs was going to end in handshakes or something requiring Grace to bleach the carpet. She learned Taekwondo from a retired instructor named Mr. O, who taught her that the fastest way to win a fight was to make sure you never needed to have it. She learned constitutional law, oddly, from Taesung himself, who kept a surprising library of legal texts, the only weapon, he told her once, that can dismantle an empire without firing a single bullet. He'd meant it as caution. It would later become prophecy. Not everyone in the household approved of the arrangement. Han Junho, Taesung's oldest friend and second in command, a man whose loyalty had survived 3 decades, 2 federal investigations, and 1 memorable incident involving a rival gang and a shipping container, watched the girls rise through the household with an expression that never quite settled into a smile. You're building a house of cards, old friend, Han warned one night, watching 12-year-old turned 14-year-old Amara correct one of Taesung's lawyers on a point of maritime law, purely for sport. A stray wolf pup doesn't stay a pup. Someday she'll be a wolf in a den full of tigers, and you won't like which one wins. Then I'll make sure she becomes a better wolf than any tiger in this house, Taesung said, and went back to his tea, unbothered, a man who had clearly never read a single cautionary fable in his life, or had read all of them and decided to write his own ending instead. Here's a question worth sitting with, the kind of question that tends to separate the people who understand loyalty from the people who only understand leverage. If you'd spent 30 years building trust with someone, and then watched them choose a stranger over the throne they'd promised you, would you call it betrayal, or would you call it the truth finally catching up to you? Drop your answer in the comments, because Han Junho was about to answer that question in the ugliest way imaginable, and you're going to want to have picked a side before you see what he does with it. By 16, Amara had stopped flinching at the sound of raised voices. By 18, she'd read every legal text in Taesung's library twice. By 22, she'd graduated top of her class at a law school that had no idea their star pupil had once slept in a refrigerator box, and had absolutely no idea that her adoptive father's organization moved more product through the port of Newark than 3 legitimate shipping companies combined. And somewhere in the back of the house, in a study he thought no one paid attention to, Han Junho had begun, quietly, patiently, the way rot begins in a foundation no one bothers to inspect, rerouting shipments, forging signatures, and building a case file with one very specific name at the top of it. Not Taesung's. Amara's. Because the wolf pup Han had warned about 15 years ago wasn't the danger at all. She was the witness. And in Han Junho's world, witnesses were a problem you solved before they solved you. Graduation day should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like a chess match where Amara could see 3 moves ahead and didn't like a single one of them. She stood at the podium of her law school's auditorium in a cap and gown that still smelled faintly of dry cleaning chemicals, delivering the valedictorian speech to a room full of proud parents, ambitious classmates, And, in the third row, looking as out of place as a shark at a christening, 6 men in dark suits who were absolutely not there for the free punch. Tae-sung sat among them, hands folded, watching his daughter speak about justice and second chances with the quiet, devastated pride of a man who had built an empire on the exact opposite principles and somehow still produced a daughter who believed in them anyway. It was, he'd admit only to himself, the single greatest contradiction of his life, and also, strangely, the thing he was proudest of. Justice, Amara told the crowd, isn't a debt collected in blood. It's a debt collected in truth. And truth, unlike money, cannot be laundered. Somewhere in that crowd, Han Jun-ho clapped along with everyone else, his expression pleasant, his eyes doing math that had nothing to do with pride. He had heard that line about truth and laundering, and privately, bitterly, thought, how inconvenient for men like me. After the ceremony, in the parking lot, Han caught Tae-sung alone by the car. She's sharp, Han said, in the tone of a man complimenting a knife he intended to eventually get stabbed by. Sharp enough to notice things. Shipping discrepancies. Irregular signatures. The kind of things a lawyer's eye can't help but catch, even when she's not looking for them. She's not interested in the business, Jun-ho, Tae-sung said. She's interested in justice. There's a difference, though I understand you've never needed to learn it. Han smiled the way men smile when they've already made a decision and are simply enjoying the last few seconds of pretending otherwise. Let's hope justice doesn't come looking for us before we're ready for it. It was, in hindsight, the most honest thing Han said in 15 years, because he already knew justice was coming. He was, after all, the one building the road it would walk down. 3 weeks later, Amara took a position at a mid-size firm in Manhattan, determined to build a career entirely separate from her father's world. A decision that lasted exactly 4 months before her father's world came looking for her anyway, the way gravity comes looking for anything foolish enough to think it can simply walk away from the ground. It started small. A federal informant named Terrence Boyd, a low-level dock worker turned witness, the kind of man who sold secrets the way other men sold hot dogs, cheap and with mediocre judgment, was found dead in a Newark motel room, his testimony against the Beck-Ho syndicate conveniently silenced before he could deliver it. 2 weeks later, federal agents arrived at the Riverdale house with a warrant, a folder of doctored phone records, and a very confident theory that Kang Tae-sung had ordered the hit personally. Amara found out from the news, like everyone else in America found out that their father had allegedly ordered a murder, which is to say, badly, publicly, and with a knot in her stomach that felt exactly like December 2011, minus the cardboard box. She drove to the Riverdale house that night faster than any speed limit in 3 states would have approved of, and found Tae-sung sitting alone in his study, uncharacteristically still, staring at a phone record printout like it was a language he'd never learned. I didn't do this, he said, before she could ask. I know, Amara said, and meant it with a certainty that surprised even her. Not because she trusted him blindly, but because 15 years of watching this man operate had taught her exactly what his fingerprints looked like on a lie, and this wasn't one of them. But someone did, and they wanted it to look like you. Tae-sung looked up at her, the girl he'd pulled out of a box on Flatbush Avenue, now a woman standing in his study with a law degree, a spine of steel, and an expression that meant she'd already started building a defense in her head. You should walk away from this, he said. This isn't your fight. You told me once, Amara said, that the world already decided what I'd become the day it left me in that box. You told me to prove it wrong with paperwork, not bullets. She set her bag down on his desk, the same desk where she'd once corrected his lawyers on maritime law for sport. So that's exactly what I'm going to do, starting with finding out who really killed Terrence Boyd, and why they wanted it to look like you. Neither of them noticed, in that moment, the shape of a man standing just outside the study door, listening in the dark with the patience of someone who had been waiting 15 years for exactly this kind of trouble to walk through the front door. The courtroom on the 14th floor of the Southern District Courthouse had the particular hush of a room where everyone understood that history was about to be rewritten, one way or another. Amara sat at the defense table beside her father, her legal pad covered in the kind of tight, furious handwriting that comes from a mind working faster than a hand can keep up with. She hadn't slept in 4 days. She'd read every page of the prosecution's evidence twice, and something about the phone records kept snagging in her brain like a thread on a nail. Not because they were fake, exactly, but because they were too clean. Real evidence had smudges. Real evidence had gaps, inconsistencies, the fingerprints of human error. This had none of that. It read like something engineered, not discovered. Ms. Johnson, Judge Whitfield said, peering over her glasses at the young attorney who had, against every recommendation of the firm she worked for, insisted on personally defending her own father. You may begin your cross-examination. Amara rose. Across the courtroom, the prosecution's star witness, a forensic data analyst named Roland Pratt, hired by the federal government to walk the jury through Terrence Boyd's final phone activity, adjusted his tie with the mild confidence of a man who thought this would be easy. It would not be easy. Mr. Pratt, Amara said, you testified that Terrence Boyd's phone shows a call placed to a number registered to my father's shipping company at 11:47 p.m., approximately 40 minutes before his estimated time of death. Correct? Correct. And this call, according to your report, lasted exactly 6 minutes and 12 seconds. Yes. Mr. Pratt, in your 15 years analyzing cellular metadata, have you ever seen a call log with 0 signal degradation artifacts? Not one dropped packet, not one tower handoff delay, despite Mr. Boyd's phone moving, according to GPS data, through 3 different cell tower zones during that call. A pause. The kind of pause that, in courtroom dramas, usually means the ground is about to shift, and in real courtrooms, means exactly the same thing, just with worse lighting. That would be unusual, Pratt admitted. Unusual, Amara repeated, letting the word sit in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Mr. Pratt, isn't it true that a call log without a single signal artifact isn't unusual because it's rare? It's unusual because it's synthetic? Fabricated, not recorded. Objection! The prosecutor barked, rising so fast his chair nearly toppled. Counsel is testifying, not questioning. Sustained. Rephrase, Ms. Johnson. Amara didn't blink. Let me rephrase, Your Honor. She turned back to Pratt, pulling a printout from her folder, one she'd built at 3 a.m. that morning with the kind of caffeine-fueled clarity that only exists in the deepest, most desperate hours of a case. Mr. Pratt, I'd like to submit Defense Exhibit 14, a comparative metadata analysis of 200 authentic call logs from the same telecom provider, cross-referenced against the log you presented as evidence. Can you tell the jury what percentage of those 200 authentic logs share the exact same signal signature as the one attributed to Terrence Boyd's call? Pratt studied the sheet. His jaw tightened, just slightly, the universal tell of a man realizing, in real time, that he'd built his testimony on a foundation somebody else had poured, and poured badly. 0%, he said quietly. The courtroom did that thing courtrooms do in movies and, occasionally, in real life. It went very, very still, the kind of stillness that is weight, that presses down on the room like humidity before a storm. 0%, Amara repeated, letting the number hang in the air like a verdict of its own. So this evidence, the cornerstone of the government's timeline, the evidence used to justify a warrant against my father, was not extracted from Terrence Boyd's actual phone activity. It was constructed by someone with access to telecom infrastructure most private citizens could never touch. She turned, slow and deliberate, to face the jury. Someone with resources, someone with motive, and someone, ladies and gentlemen, who is very deliberately not sitting at this defense table. Behind her, Tae-sung sat motionless, his face a carefully composed mask, but his knuckles, gripping the edge of the table, had gone white. Because he, better than anyone in that room, understood exactly what kind of access it took to fabricate telecom metadata that clean. It wasn't federal agency-level access. It was syndicate-level access, which meant the person who framed him wasn't a stranger, a rival, or a federal overreach. It was someone inside his own house. Recess was called for 1 hour. It was, in the history of the Kong family, possibly the longest 60 minutes ever recorded. Amara found her father in a small conference room down the hall, still wearing the composed mask he'd perfected over 30 years of business meetings where the wrong facial expression could end in someone's disappearance. But she'd grown up reading that face like scripture, and she could see the cracks now, hairline and spreading. Syndicate-level access, she said, closing the door behind her. That's what you're thinking. That's why your hands haven't stopped shaking since Pratt said 0%. I'm thinking, Tae-sung said carefully, that this conversation should happen somewhere with fewer federal listening devices. Then think fast, because whoever did this isn't finished. Terrence Boyd wasn't just a random informant, was he? I pulled his file last night. Amara set a folder on the table, thinner than the one she'd built for court, but heavier in every way that mattered. 15 years ago, a dock worker named Terrence Boyd called Child Protective Services about a homeless kid sleeping in a box on Flatbush Avenue. Try to get her placed in foster care before some unstable criminal could exploit her. That call went nowhere. CPS was overwhelmed. The kid disappeared into private custody before anyone followed up. But the call is on record. She looked up. That kid was me. And the only reason anyone would connect a low-level informant's 15-year-old CPS call to your current murder charge is if somebody handed that connection to the prosecution on a silver platter, to make sure that if this case ever came apart, it would come apart pointing at me as your motive, not away from whoever actually did it. Tae-sung's expression didn't just crack. It shattered, quietly, the way glass sometimes does, more devastating for the silence than the sound. Han, he said. It wasn't a question. He warned you, Amara said softly. 15 years ago. He told you a stray wolf pup doesn't stay a pup. I thought he meant it as advice. I think now he meant it as a promise. They found him 20 minutes later, not fleeing. Han Jun-ho was too proud, too confident, too certain of 30 years of loyalty as armor, to run. He was in the courthouse cafeteria, drinking coffee like a man with nowhere to be, which, in fairness, was exactly the energy of every villain in the 10 seconds before the walls close in. You knew, Amara said, sliding into the seat across from him, her voice low enough that the surrounding tables didn't turn. Not just about the frame job. About Terrence Boyd 15 years ago. You knew he tried to get me removed before my father could get attached. And when you needed a scapegoat motive for a murder you committed, you reached back 15 years and used me as the reason. Han set down his coffee with the unhurried calm of a man who had, for the first time in the conversation, stopped pretending. You were always going to be a problem, Amara. Not because of who you are. Because of who he became after he found you. Kang Tae-sung built an empire on never letting sentiment touch business. And then a black girl in a cardboard box walked in and rewired 30 years of discipline in one night. He shrugged, almost apologetic, almost infuriatingly sincere. I watched a man I respected more than my own father start choosing bedtime stories over board meetings. I told him it would cost him the empire. He didn't listen, so I made sure the empire would survive without him, under someone who never let a stray kid off a sidewalk make his decisions for him. You killed Terrence Boyd, Amara said, and framed my father to protect an empire from the man who built it. I protected it, Han corrected, from becoming soft. There's a difference, though I understand you've never needed to learn it. A bitter, deliberate echo of Tae-sung's own words to him, months earlier, and somehow, that was the moment Amara understood exactly how long this betrayal had been marinating, exactly how personal it had always been. Here's what you didn't count on, Amara said, standing, sliding a small recorder across the table, one she'd activated the moment she sat down, a habit her father had drilled into her since childhood. Always assume the room is listening, because in this family, it usually is. You didn't count on a stray wolf pup growing up to be better at your own game than you are. Han's face, for the first time in 15 years, lost its composure entirely. Because reflected in the cafeteria window behind Amara, walking in with 2 federal marshals and an expression that could curdle milk from across the room, was Judge Whitfield's bailiff, flanked by agents who had, thanks to a very quietly forwarded recording, just gotten everything they needed. The house Han Jun-ho had spent 15 years quietly rebuilding had just come down on top of him, one recorded confession at a time. Courtrooms rarely get second acts. This one got one anyway. By the time the afternoon session resumed, word of what happened in the cafeteria had traveled through the courthouse with the speed and inevitability of bad weather. The prosecutor, a man named Whitmore who had built his entire case on evidence he now understood to be about as trustworthy as a con man's handshake, approached the bench looking like someone who'd just realized he'd been playing chess against an opponent who'd already won 3 moves ago. "Your Honor," he said, "the government requests a recess to review new evidence that has come to light regarding the credibility of key testimony in this case." Judge Whitfield, who had been on the bench long enough to recognize the specific flavor of chaos currently unfolding in her courtroom, granted it with the weary patience of a woman who'd seen a lot of things, but rarely anything this dramatic before 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. What followed over the next several hours was less a courtroom proceeding and more a controlled demolition. The recording Amara had captured, Han Junho's own voice, calm and almost proud, laying out 15 years of resentment, a fabricated murder, and a betrayal so precisely engineered it would have made Machiavelli take notes, was turned over to federal agents, who moved on Han before he'd finished his second cup of courthouse coffee. It turned out pride really was expensive, just not always in the way Tae-sung had once warned his men about. The forensic data Amara had exposed on the stand was re-examined by an independent analyst, who confirmed within hours what Amara had already proven with a legal pad and 4 sleepless nights. The metadata had indeed been fabricated, using a proprietary telecom access protocol that, embarrassingly for the prosecution, could be traced to exactly one man's private security credentials, Han Junho's. By evening, the murder charge against Kang Tae-sung had been formally dropped. By the next morning, Han Junho had been charged with murder, obstruction of justice, and, in a detail the tabloids found deliciously ironic, fraud against the very organization he'd spent 30 years pretending to protect. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered on the steps in the kind of feeding frenzy usually reserved for celebrity divorces or unexpected election results. Cameras flashed, microphones jostled for position, and Kang Tae-sung, a man who had spent 30 years being photographed only in the moments before something terrible happened to someone else, stood on the steps of a federal courthouse as a free man, for once the subject of a story that didn't end in tragedy. "Mr. Kang," a reporter shouted, "how does it feel to be cleared of these charges?" Tae-sung looked, for a long moment, like a man searching for the kind of composed, careful non-answer he'd given reporters and federal agents alike for 3 decades. And then he looked at his daughter, standing beside him in a blazer that had seen 4 sleepless nights and 1 very dramatic cross-examination, and something in him simply stopped performing. 15 years ago, he said, his voice rough in a way none of his own men had ever heard it. "I stopped my car for a child freezing on a sidewalk because I couldn't save my own daughter, and I refused to let that happen twice. Everyone told me it would cost me everything." He paused, and for the first time in front of a bank of cameras, in front of federal agents, in front of God and CNN and everyone, Kang Tae-sung's eyes went wet. Today, that same child stood in a courtroom and saved the only thing I had left. So to everyone who told me love was bad for business. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The image said it for him. A Korean crime boss with 30 years of blood on his ledger, crying openly on a courthouse staircase, one arm wrapped around the shoulders of the black daughter he'd pulled out of a cardboard box on a night the whole world had decided to walk past her. Somewhere in a federal holding cell, Han Junho sat in silence, finally understanding, far too late to matter, that he had spent 15 years trying to protect an empire from softness, and in doing so, had missed the one thing that actually made empires last. Not fear, not blood, not loyalty bought with silence. Family, the kind you don't inherit, the kind you choose, and then spend 15 years proving you'd choose again. 6 months after the verdict, the Riverdale house looked almost unrecognizable, not structurally, but in the way a house changes when the fear finally moves out of it. The men who used to clean firearms in the study now mostly played cards. Grace Okafor had taken to humming while she cooked, something she hadn't done in 15 years, because a humming housekeeper, as it turns out, is the surest sign that a house has stopped holding its breath. Kang Tae-sung had not, contrary to what several optimistic tabloid headlines suggested, become a changed man overnight. Empires, even ones built on shipping manifests, favors, and the occasional persuasive baseball bat, don't dissolve because their owner cried on a courthouse staircase. But something had shifted, quietly and permanently, in the architecture of how he ran things. He'd handed off two-thirds of the Beckho syndicate's more legally creative operations to men he trusted with the business, but not, notably, with his daughter's safety, a distinction that would have baffled him 15 years ago, and now felt like the only distinction that mattered. Amara, for her part, had become something of an accidental legend in legal circles. The woman who'd walked into a federal courtroom to defend her own father and walked out having dismantled a 15-year conspiracy with a legal pad and a well-placed recorder. Firms that once passed on hiring her now called weekly. She turned most of them down. She'd started, instead, a small practice of her own in Brooklyn, 3 blocks, in a small and entirely unplanned irony, from the spot where a refrigerator box had once been the only roof over her head. You could have taken any of those offers, Tae-sung said one evening, watching her review case files at the same dining table where she'd once corrected his lawyers on maritime law for sport. Corner offices. 7 figures. Instead, you're defending people who can't afford a retainer, 3 blocks from where you nearly froze to death. You taught me that, Amara said, not looking up. You said the world already decided what I'd become the day it left me in that box. Turns out the world's still deciding that about a lot of kids on that street. Somebody should be there to argue back. Tae-sung was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man who had built his entire identity on control and was still, 15 years later, occasionally ambushed by how much his daughter had exceeded every plan he'd ever made for her. Han asks about you, he said eventually. In his letters. From prison. Amara's pen paused, just slightly, over the file in front of her. What does he say? That he was wrong, Tae-sung said. Not about the murder. He's not sorry about that, not really. He's wrong about you. He thought you were a weakness that would break this family apart. Instead, Tae-sung allowed himself, rare enough that Grace would have marked the calendar if she'd seen it, a small and genuine smile. Instead, you're the reason it's still standing. Amara set down her pen. Outside the window, Brooklyn traffic hummed past in the golden wash of a September evening. The same borough, the same cold pavement that had once nearly killed her, now just a city doing what cities do, indifferent and alive and entirely unaware of the miracle that had happened on one of its sidewalks 15 years ago. He was half right, you know, she said. I was a weakness. Still am. You'd burn this whole empire down for me without blinking, and we both know it. She smiled, the same sharp, unshakable smile that had once made a forensic analyst crumble on the witness stand. But he was wrong about what weakness means. He thought it was the crack that breaks a house apart. He never understood it's usually the thing that makes people fight hard enough to keep it standing. Tae-sung reached across the table, an old, familiar gesture, the same hand that had once wrapped a cashmere coat around a freezing, half-conscious child on a Brooklyn sidewalk, and covered his daughter's hand with his own. 15 years ago, he said quietly, I stopped the car for a stranger. Best business decision I ever made. Worst thing you ever said to a courtroom full of federal agents, Amara said, laughing despite herself. Love is bad for business. You're never living that down. No, Tae-sung agreed. And for once, the coldest man in Brooklyn's underworld didn't sound like he minded losing it all. I don't think I ever will. Outside, the box that had once nearly ended a 12-year-old girl's life was long gone, hauled away with the rest of December's trash 15 winters ago, forgotten by a city that never once looked back. But somewhere in that same city, in a small law office 3 blocks from a stretch of sidewalk that no longer meant cold or hunger or fear, a woman who had once been thrown away by the world sat working late into the evening, saving other people's families the way someone had once, against every rule that governed his violent, careful life, chosen to save hers. Some empires are built on fear. Hers was built on the one night a man decided fear wasn't worth more than a freezing child on a sidewalk, and 15 years later, that decision was still the only thing keeping either of them standing.